Hold on one second. Good morning, good afternoon in Glasgow, and good evening, depending on where you are on this forward planet. This is still wrapping up the pandemic. For the last 2 weeks has been full of discussions among those who are focused on climate change about the next steps for the treaty, the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement from 2015, and now the Glasgow Consensus, or whatever the document will be, the declaration that will be coming either tonight or more likely perhaps Saturday, depending on how these things work. I'm really pleased that a number of journalists who have been working the floor there at the conference the last 2 weeks from around the world are here to give you a briefing on how things have gone. There's a lot of spin always at these meetings, and that's why journalists are, that's not just because I am a journalist. Their job is to sort of disentangle what's real, and to do it for the audiences that matter from where they are. And here we have a great galaxy of people, adding another one, Jennifer Corpus. So ideally, let's just go around the circle here and just tell us where you're from, and that's the first step. So maybe Zico, where are you from, and what's been your focus, and then we'll go around.
All right. Hey, my name is Zico Kosi. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. That is a small island developing state in the Caribbean region. So I've been focusing on two things. From a regional perspective, the Caribbean is disproportionately affected by intensifying hurricanes each year. So warming seas are leading to more and more intense hurricane seasons. We're seeing a lot more Category 5 hurricane seasons. So at the top of the agenda for the region is keeping 1.5 alive, and of course, loss and damage funding. Trinidad and Tobago, however, is in a really unique position because we sit outside the hurricane belt, and we have a hydrocarbon economy, oil and gas. So we are actually the fifth highest emitter per capita in the world, but we're also looked to as a leader in our region for leading conversations on energy. So we don't really face some of the more immediate effects of climate change, my country specifically, but we are a regional leader and have a very difficult position to straddle. So I've been looking at energy transition for my country. I've been looking at loss and damage. I've been looking at all the different interests of SIDS. Climate finance, of course, has been a pretty major thing that I've been looking at as well for adaptation for my country as well. We're going and looking for climate finance for adaptation. I could talk so much more, but let's hear from everyone else.
Yeah, that balance between energy access and the right to generate energy with fossil fuels, if you're a country that has not had a history of emitting a lot of fossil emissions, is a big one. Not West Africa, many African nations now have barely contributed to global warming. They do have gas resources, and for them it's a complication. They feel, especially in countries where there's very little access to energy. And I've been in places where, in India and Africa, where biomass burning, where women really are the energy for cooking. They collect the biomass, the sticks and wood, and if you have a gas resource, what is the right of the rich world to say you can't use that anymore? So that's one of those other complexities. That's great. And Domenica, where are you from, and how's it been going?
Hi.
What's your focus?
Okay. My name is Dominica. I'm from Ecuador, and well, I've been focusing a lot on indigenous people because that's something that I like. There are a lot of indigenous peoples from Ecuador here right now, from the Amazon, and um, yeah. So I've been trying to follow what they have been doing here. They have been presenting a lot of initiatives, and I think that the fact that they have been mentioning both of the drafts of this year's decisions say a lot about their work here at this COP. And yeah, I've also been writing a lot about our president was here, and um, announced that there was going to be a new marine reserve at the Galapagos Islands. So I've been trying to understand that relation with climate change and how oceans are also uh, a big part of climate change. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that marine reserve expansion was just announced, right? Was that yesterday or longer ago?
No, it was actually the beginning of the COP. I think it was November
Okay.
1st or 2nd. Yeah.
Yeah, this gets to something I've heard increasingly. Zico, you mentioned small island states. Increasingly, I'm hearing them speak of themselves as large ocean states, big ocean states. I don't know if you've heard that, but I was going to write something about this soon. They have huge marine territories, they're national, and so I love the idea of flipping it around to big ocean states. I don't know if that'll catch on eventually. When I was writing about this in 1988, it was the small island states were starting to become a significant force in the conversation.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting issue. And the oceans, of course, are really part of the solution and part of the problem. Jennifer, good morning. I mean, good afternoon. How are things for you, and what are you focusing on?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer. I am from the Philippines. I'm a member, I'm from the Kankanaoy Igorot people, indigenous people in the Philippines. And I'm a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity, on climate change, focusing specifically on Article 6 as part of the Article 6 working group. I'm also the global policy lead of Niatero, an organization that supports indigenous governance and self-determination. So I'm participating here coming from the standpoint of an indigenous person, where we are maintaining 80% of the world's remaining forest biodiversity and contributing significantly to to climate mitigation, despite the fact that we have not contributed to climate change, and we are suffering disproportionately the effects of climate change. So I'm following, as I said earlier, Article 6, the carbon markets discussions, climate finance, the renewal of the mandate of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, and that was adopted last night at the first part of the closing plenary. Loss and damage as well, in particularly non-economic losses, because of the impacts on the spiritual and cultural values of indigenous peoples of climate change. Then agriculture, particularly indigenous food systems and food sovereignty. And finally, the CTCN, and we were very happy also to see this decision that includes a seat for indigenous peoples in the CTCN. Thanks.
Can you? That's it's great, and I've been tracking Niatero's evolution for a while. I'm just going to show something here, a tweet from earlier in the week. Let's see if it'll pop up. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about Niatero.
Yes, Niatero is an organization, as I said, that supports indigenous governance. So we have what we call place-anchored partnerships. But we believe that indigenous peoples who have a spiritual, reciprocal, relational, relationship with their ecosystems are the best guardians of nature. And we are, if indigenous peoples' self-determination is recognized and respected, and if their priorities for the management of their territories are supported, then they will continue to contribute greatly to the double crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change impacts that we are experiencing. So that's our mission as Niatero.
Yeah, I did a webcast some months ago with Indonesian indigenous representatives talking also about the benefit to mitigating pandemic risk as well. Of course, when forests stay standing and when you don't have extractive economies moving into areas like that, you can withstand public health crisis as well, which of course was particularly severe for indigenous people and remains so. So it's great to have you as part of this discussion. Thanks for being here. We'll circle back in a minute, and we'll talk about. It'd be great to get some more understanding for people about what Article 6 is as well. And so back to the circle here, Vishana, can you fill us in a little bit on where you're from and what you've been covering?
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm Vishani. I'm a journalist from Guyana, which is a country that's geographically in South America. We are part of the Caribbean, and we consider ourselves one of the small island developing states / low-lying countries. For COP26, a lot of what I've been focusing on, as Zico mentioned, is climate finance, because that's particularly important for smaller countries, developing countries that are grappling with the disproportionate effects of climate change. But also particular to Guyana, I've also been following the conversation on the conservation of forests, because about 85% of our country, which is about the size of England, is covered in pristine forests. And so we're a huge carbon sink for the globe. And so, as part of that, what my leaders have been advocating for was climate the payments for those forest services, and that, of course, is something that they've raised at COP. And it's really interesting because just about 3 days before COP, we launched a new developmental plan until 2030, which speaks to us actually getting those payments to fund our development. And it's also important to note that now, as many of you might know, Guyana has just become an oil producing nation, which makes its conversations on conservation kind of tricky. Some call it hypocritical that Guyana has now entered this oil and gas phase while it's advocating for these conservation efforts. So it's just really interesting being a Guyanese and being part of all these conversations on conservation.
Yeah, well, that gets back to what we were just talking about with Trinidad as well. And again, a number of sub-Saharan African nations have that same paradox. And it really isn't a paradox when you think about fairness. Countries that have 200 years of fossil fuel development, it's hard for me to see the justification for them saying, oh, you all can't we're not going to finance your development of your gas particularly, because it also produces LPG, which is a great cooking fuel. And that dynamic is one of the things I'm trying to write about myself today before the day is out, is there's an evolving concept of energy justice within climate justice. And I think there's a lot of legitimacy to it, especially when you look at historic emissions. So I don't know, that's an issue that may linger. I know it will linger beyond tonight or tomorrow when this meeting gavels. So it's an important one. And Chris, how's the climate tracking team? What's this been like this year? You've been doing this for several years, right? Bringing journalists to the COP.
Yeah, it's the first time in a while that I'm not there with them, so it's been very nervous from the sidelines. I feel like a parent who's let their kids go to school and then you kind of don't know what's going on. But they've been doing an awesome job. I mean, I think it's kind of one of the more diverse groups that we've had, and we've had both an online group and an in-person group. And Vishani is here from the online group, and that's been doing some really interesting coverage, because obviously it's been so difficult for journalists from around the world to join COP this year. And I think that kind of we've seen some reporters in Brazil, from Egypt, Vishani from Guyana, reporters from Southern Africa, being able to cover COP this year in a way that probably wasn't possible in previous COPs because not so much was online. But I would also say that probably was more difficult this year with some of the extra limitations that they put on right at the end, even making virtual participation a little bit more difficult than we'd probably expected. So I think it's been pretty good, and I'm just glad that we got through it without a COVID scare, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure another journalist, an American journalist, Tina Gerhardt, who was supposed to be on the show this morning, she has the flu. She just developed it there. So they're also just like standard health risks, especially if you're coming from a developing country to to a place like that. That could be a challenge too. I'll show some of your website in a minute. Maybe we'll dig in a little more. One other theme that seems to have come up for me, not being there, is the role of technology in advancing countries' ambitions. This relates to both forests and emissions of methane, for example. There are satellite methods now, and even like the Environmental Defense Fund is launching a satellite to track methane, and it's pretty clear to me that there's the whole forest commitment that came out, and there's the Forest Monitor website now, which is sort of doing live tracking of the carbon content of forests, and that can facilitate the finance that Vishani was talking about in terms of Guyana getting compensation for forest carbon. The clearer a picture we have of it, the easier that is to do. So I don't know whether that's been something you've seen. Maybe back to Zico. What are some of the background insights that have developed for you here? That's one for me, that technology is helping drive countries' ambitions. But what other big themes have kind of popped up?
Well, the big themes that have popped up for small island developing states here at COP26 for me is that the action doesn't really match. Sorry, the action doesn't match the rhetoric. So we've heard a lot of lip service being paid towards advancing the interests of small island developing states. But what we really need to see is a fund operationalized to make loss and damage funding accessible. So the biggest problem that small island developing states face right now is that we are not classified as poor countries. So we don't have easy access to emergency funding, contingency funding. Well, let's say a Category 5 hurricane wipes out your island, like what happened to Barbuda in 2017 with Hurricane Irma. Because of how they're categorized as a middle-income country, it doesn't factor in the unique vulnerability that a small island faces. Because if you have a large landmass, you can pool resources from everywhere, but a small island, it's just not possible. So
right.
The whole concept of liability, that he who pollutes must pay, has become continues to be rather very controversial. So one major thing that took place is when Scotland pledged £1 million to a loss and damage fund. As small as that contribution may have
So
been.
we lost you there.
Oh,
hold
can
on,
you hear me now?
me.
Yeah.
1 second. It might be my audio. Hold on a second. Switch my. Let's try that. Yeah. For some reason, I wasn't hearing Zico just then. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, yeah, they were back. I'm sorry. My earbuds.
Yeah.
Just throw these things out. Sorry. So just repeat what you were saying about.
Loss and damage. Okay, so what's been really critical for small island developing states is wanting to see a funding mechanism, the funding mechanism for loss and damage, be operationalized, so that there's the vulnerability that small islands face in terms of the ability of a hurricane to wipe out your entire economy overnight, to have your entire island evacuated overnight. They want to see that vulnerability factored into how they can access emergency funding. And there needs to be a dedicated loss and damage fund in order to see that happen. And when you look at where things are right now, it's a lot of vague language, even with regards to the Santiago network. When you look at the draft text on loss and damage, everything still seems very vague. And I speak to the negotiators from IOSIS. I speak to negotiations from the various party delegations from small island developing states. And they do say that they are hopeful that the final decision may see some breakthroughs, but the general consensus is that in terms of what's really needed, because the need is urgent, it doesn't seem likely. They're talking about further operationalization of the Santiago network, but one has to ask, what does further operationalization mean if its current operationalization is very confusing? You ask everybody, what does the Santiago network entail? And you get a wide range of answers and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, it is tough. That one is particularly challenging because, like Caribbean hurricanes, I've written quite a bit about hurricanes and climate change, and the connections are really still sort of mixed bag. So it's not as if every bad hurricane season can be ascribed to global warming, and that's one of the issues. And I know that I remember covering Copenhagen. The American delegation at that time was saying about the historic responsibility part. They don't want to. They were really saying, "Well, look, and there are counter arguments against this, but they would say, um, you know, the world didn't really understand this problem for 100 years of our history, so we can't be fully obliged to be. They don't want to be locked into a compensation mode." You'll hear that argument over and over again. I'm not sure if
So
Europe
I
is
have
the same.
I have tuned in to the debates between, is this charity or is this something that's owed as a result of the damage inflicted? But like you said, small island developing states are not responsible for this crisis. Even Trinidad and Tobago, which has a high carbon footprint,
Right.
cannot be held responsible for this crisis because the Caribbean actually contributes 0.4% of greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
It's negligible, and all small island developing states together contribute less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. G20 nations contribute 80%. So when you talk about one tiny island like Barbuda, for example, that had a population of 1,600 people that had to be entirely evacuated to Antigua, that island is still reeling from the effects of a hurricane in 2017. COP26 President Alok Sharma drew reference to this as one of the first things that he said at the opening plenary, that he recently visited with people from Barbuda who are still reeling from one hurricane in 2017, Hurricane Irma. Now, I understand what you're saying, that it's not fully clear what the link is between the more intense hurricane seasons we're experiencing and global warming. But what the science, I believe, this is conclusive about, is that warmer seas may not cause a more frequency of hurricanes, but it will increase the likelihood that hurricanes can become more intense, which is why some of the hurricanes that have hit over the past 5 years have actually been the most intense in terms of category 5, highest level, most intense hurricanes that have ever hit some of our islands in recorded history. So these are facts that I do believe need to be taken into account. And at the very least, I believe that what small island states are advocating for here is that the unique vulnerability of small countries that have to rely on other states if they get entirely wiped out, but that the unique vulnerability at least needs to be factored in when it comes to the speed at which they can access contingency funding. Because you can't, when you've been hit by a hurricane, you can't go through red tape and wait years to access funding when people are suffering right now. So, and that's not advanced very well at COP26. But it should be on the agenda at COP27.
It feels like it's getting enough traction that it's not going to go away. The justice issue, as I said before, even on the energy side, energy production, here in terms of impacts, the world has got these climate divides that are astounding. The adaptation gap report that came out last Friday, a week ago, really shows a stark picture of a world of protected and unprotected societies. And even if you take away the global warming part, it feels like there's so much of the colonial history, the other aspects of what the rich world has and how it got rich compared to countries that are remaining vulnerable now. I would think there would be ethical logic to this kind of a system, even setting aside the global warming question. But I'm hoping that can build forward. Maybe we'll circle back to the forest question. And in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, let me just shift the screen here. Jennifer, Indonesia, I had indigenous representatives from Indonesia on here a few months ago. And maybe our colleague from Ecuador, Domenica, can talk a little bit about the situation now as opposed to a couple of years ago. Do you feel like the trajectory is in the right direction?
I mean,
Jennifer.
yes. I
Oh,
feel
sorry.
like, oh, sorry. I just
It's
feel
okay.
like they have been like occupying a lot more political spaces, which has allowed them to like raise their voices a little more. But I do think that there's still a lot of work to do, because a lot of people think that because they're indigenous they are not educated, and so whatever they have to say, they don't take them seriously. They yeah, they always use this discourse of um, like, you don't know what you're talking about enough, and so I'm not going to listen to you because you're just an indigenous person. um, and I think that that is really not okay, but that needs to change, because that's the only reason why like they have a lot of really good initiatives, like fighting climate change and like doing their own uh, like sustainable sort of transition to cleaner energy and to cleaner economies. But yeah, people don't take them seriously because they think because they didn't go to Harvard, they they don't know. So I think there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks, Andy,
Yeah.
and thanks, Domenica. I agree with what Domenica said, that the profile is somehow higher now. And if you recall, on the second day, it seems so long ago now, but on the second day of COP, there was the World Leaders Summit and a special segment on Indigenous peoples and forests. So I was fortunate to be able to speak at that event, and they announced 1.7 billion to be devoted specifically for forests and Indigenous peoples. And in many other activities here, Indigenous peoples have had a prominent role. So the profile is definitely higher. Of course, the question that remains is that it's very good that all of these commitments are coming in for forests and Indigenous peoples, but it's not clear what the mechanism of delivery is. Of course, the demand from Indigenous peoples has always been direct access, because frequently we're forced to go through intermediaries, and the communities get crumbs, very little amounts. And so that's one thing that we need to work on further: clarify the mechanism of delivery of direct finance to Indigenous peoples. And it's basically to support efforts that secure Indigenous tenure, because there are a lot of studies coming out that where Indigenous tenure is secure, and they are better at protecting their territories and contribute more to averting biodiversity loss and sequestering carbon. And I also wanted to there have been advances, but a lot more work needs to be done to get all of those commitments to the communities. I also wanted to answer the question on technology, and I wanted to cite two examples. I think it's really good that Indigenous peoples now have a seat in the CTCN, the Climate Technology Center and Network, because we have had experiences, particularly from our Sami brothers and sisters. So the Sami are the only Indigenous peoples in Northern Europe. They're found in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. And there was a project that was introduced in their territory, a geoengineering project, which would inject chemicals into the atmosphere to lower temperatures. And they were never consulted. So that was a big controversy. They had to protest against it because their consent was not sought or obtained. So I think it's very important for these types of technologies. We have to think very carefully about them. Are these really the technologies that we need, and are we involving Indigenous peoples in the decision making? On the other hand, we have our partners in Ecuador who are very, very interested in renewable energy technologies. So they have developed a solar canoe and it contributes to lessening of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's important to let Indigenous people speak out as to what kinds of technologies they need, and also to take into account that maybe the proven technologies like traditional knowledge are the best, one of the best approaches to addressing climate change. So
That's great. Yeah, and that reminds me of also efforts to simply empower Indigenous communities to connect with the outside world to in a two-way process, so that if there's an illegal activity on the ground in Indigenous territory, that can be transmitted quickly, and so that we can learn, methods, spread those ideas that you were just talking about, more quickly between Indigenous communities. I'm just going to show you one example that I had touched on not long ago. This is this idea that with technology, again, you can facilitate the connectivity and information flows and back and forth, so that illegal activity is highlighted. Here's an app. This is in Peru, and get more government responsiveness when something bad is happening. There was a paper written in the journal Proceedings of the National Academies earlier this year that showed how the use of this technology appears to be helping slow the impacts in places like that. So it feels like there's a lot of promise there too. But as you were saying, it has to be you can't kind of parachute in with a technology and say, hey, here we are, rich technology world. Here's some gadgets that can help you, right? I hear the word co-development or co-production of projects is the way to go.
yeah,
There are good
exactly.
stories there.
And maybe if I can say something, there's the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, and it's meant to highlight the role of traditional knowledge within the UNFCCC. Because, in the IPCC report, the latest assessment, they said that traditional knowledge has a significant role to play, but that scientists have no idea about how to tap into this traditional knowledge. So we're really happy that the next 3-year work plan of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform has been approved, because it's an opportunity to highlight these types of technologies that would be helpful for Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous technologies. So, yeah.
There we go. That sounds like a good story to keep track of. So that's I guess this is a good time to talk about what happens next for you as journalists. These COP sessions are so intense, and the story is always this little day-to-day stories. So and so, and that today is technology. Today is gender day. Today is forest day. And then you have the final negotiations, which are mostly over details that are not as consequential as what was announced in the beginning. When you go back, maybe we'll get around here a discussion about when you go back home, or actually for our Guyana friend here, now that when this pulse of coverage is done, what are the stories on your plate going forward? That's the next question. And Climate Tracker, does that keep going, the facilitation you do? So maybe we'll start with actually let's start in Guyana.
Sure. I just wanted to add something very quickly before I speak about what you've asked. And it relates to Indigenous peoples. Guyana has a fairly large Indigenous peoples population as well. And so I agree with both of the points raised by my colleagues, but I also just wanted to throw out there that from speaking to one of the two representatives that are at COP, two Indigenous representatives for Guyana at COP, something that they raised that has been a sore point for them was active exclusion in terms of using language that is beyond them. So of course, COP isn't in their traditional Wapichan language. And in addition to that, when you have discussions on jargons and they're in those decision-making spaces or those spaces where they can communicate their concerns and they want to speak about their traditional knowledge, what they've complained about is that the technical knowledge seems as though it's intentionally being used to exclude them. And so I really wanted to put that out there as well in terms of exclusion of indigenous peoples. So that actually leads into to answering what you just asked. Uh, what I'm looking at moving forward is that now that I mentioned we have this new 2030 developmental plan, it's called the Low Carbon Development Strategy. We've had it before, but it's now expanded. As part of that, the forest payments that I mentioned, it's expected that 15% of those payments will go to matters for indigenous peoples, and that includes their land rights, which is something I know that all indigenous peoples have had concerns about. So that's definitely something that I'm going to zero in on looking forward. Um, of course, I'm going to be looking at forest payments because that's something that is going to remain in the Guyana context, the Guyana conversation, because so much of our development plans are tied to us receiving this 40 billion payout from forest services. And of course, the whole conversation about the best of both worlds, I would call it, pursuing oil and gas while trying to be a low carbon developmental state. Guyana's only been in oil and gas since 2019. We are pretty new. So everything that's happening right now, we don't have experience in it, and we're now navigating all of it. And so it's really, as my country is learning, I am learning as well. And so my journalism has to keep up with what's going on.
Hmm. Actually, before we go to the next steps, you reminded me in talking about exclusion of the issue that came up with COVID-19. Just a month ago, even Greta Thunberg was saying this conference shouldn't happen because of the exclusion, the vaccination gap, and how that's excluded Marshall Islands and other countries. Has that been a story on the floor? Maybe Zico.
Absolutely. Representation has been a major issue at COP26. Before coming to COP26, I did a story where I tried to figure out how many youth from the Caribbean were going to be on their way to COP26. And the research that I did led to the answer that there were very few. From my country, I can tell you only 2 youth made it up here. One was on the party delegation, and another was able to find their way here through Youngo. So that's just my island, and my island is one of the islands that where people might be more likely to have the resources to be able to make this type of trip. So there are other islands that were totally unrepresented. I actually 2 days ago had the opportunity to go with a group of youth activists from small island developing states who were invited to meet with First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and there were only 6 youth in that room. And the coordinator who coordinated that event said that they had extreme difficulty finding people from a diverse group of people from small and developing states who were there to be able to come and meet with Nicola Sturgeon, who actually wanted to meet with us. So you walk around COP, you talk to people from our countries, and they all say the same thing. They feel very isolated. They don't see each other. We don't see each other here. So when we do see each other, it's instant camaraderie. We want to talk, we want to network, we want to share experiences. The representation is poor, and you do see it and you do feel it. And I do believe that it will impact how things have developed. That will have impacted how things have developed here at COP26 for the worse.
Anyone else been focused on that too? The lack of representation. Jennifer, yeah.
No, it's amazing for me to see the statistics that this is the COP that has the most number of registered participants in the history. And there was a 90% increase in the number of government delegates from 11,000 in Madrid to 21,000 now. And at the Indigenous Caucus, we struggle. No, it's not just the COVID-19 issues, because of course we have to be vaccinated, and the vaccination rate is very low in developing countries and in indigenous communities, but also the visas and the badges. Very, very few badges were allotted for observers. So a lot of the indigenous delegates here have to stay outside. They don't have access to the blue zone. And a lot of the indigenous delegates from Africa one of our brothers only received his visa today, and it's the last day of COP. So,
Oh my God.
which makes it really amazing for me that there are so many registered participants, but Indigenous peoples have been facing all of these barriers to COVID-19 vaccination and the badges and the visa.
That's incredible. Well, it's a shame, really. It's not the way it's supposed to be. I just wanted to show. There was a presentation by some folks, not at COP. Well, some of them were at COP on the energy justice question, and there's a slide I wanted to show. If I can just find it here. Here we go. Whoops. Hold on. All right. Show. Slideshow. Play from current slide. Here we go. Yeah, basically the graph there shows natural gas consumption, and you can see Canada, the United States are huge, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany, and you can see these tiny, tiny. Oh, there's Guyana way down to the bottom. And for these countries up here to say to these countries down here, you can't develop your gas is deeply problematic for a number of leaders, and it certainly seems to be a legitimate point. Sorry that. Oh, this is if you want to look this up, it's the OECD Development Office and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They were the ones who presented this just yesterday. Zainab Usman is from Uganda, I think, and Katie is American. And I'm sorry, I lost that slide that I was just showing. So that issue, I think, going forward, especially because the finance thing was becoming kind of a hot story, I think it probably feels like a story going forward. The energy access, energy justice part. Sorry that wasn't working very well. So maybe that for Vishani too, and Zico, who's from another oil-producing state, that feels like it'll be an interesting issue. So let's just get back to that question of what's next. And Ecuador actually as well has the same challenge, balancing resource production and these conservation questions. So Domenica, going home, what's the story for you?
I've just been thinking a lot about the contradictions of the government here. Like they've been signing a lot of declarations on protecting the forests and the oceans, but we have a presidential decree that doubles the oil extraction from the Amazon. So, I mean, it is just very contradictory to have a discourse of yeah, we want to fight climate change when you want to duplicate your oil production. And also, he also just, the president released another decree that is supposed to give more mining concessions to mining companies. So I've just been trying to understand those contradictions, and I think that's what I'm taking home.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
They're huge, and they're here in the United States. And the politics of this is so challenging. Republicans right now are criticizing the administration over rising gasoline prices. And the average American is much more focused on gasoline prices than on climate change. And so you end up with the president going to a meeting like this, pointing out the hypocrisy of saying we need to lower gas prices, get more production of oil, while we also need to cut emissions globally. And that leads to all those questions about things like carbon capture, again, back to the technology side. So that issue, the paradox is there, the politics of current needs, and our politics still doesn't really reach into the future very much, versus these big global considerations means there's no easy answers, and the stories really persist. They're not journalists, we're all journalists. Jessica, you're more as a commentator or a champion for change. But as a journalist, realizing that these are not it's not like writing about. Most stories have a beginning, middle, and an end, right? And this development challenge, the development energy environment challenge, is not like that. So is that something when you go to your newsroom, or let's just talk a little bit about the news process here for each of you too, who you write for, how that ends up being perceived by editors, and then how it's received by the public, which is the most important part, is challenging. When just to tell you, when I was at the New York Times in 2007, I launched a blog there, .earth, because I had a hard time fitting this story into the conventional architecture of a news article. It's more like a conversation, more like a long-term story, and so the blog felt better. So that was one of my transitions. But what's it like, Zico? Just fill us in a little bit on how you write, who you write for, and how that feels. Is it hard to sell this story? Are people reading these stories?
So I've been writing for the leading daily newspaper in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the Trinidad Express, as a freelancer since I've been here. And I must say that I am a little surprised by the level of receptiveness to certain stories. I think that the interest in climate change would have been a lot greater heading into COP26. And I do see that there is an effort, not just by this newspaper, but by all newspapers in my country. For the first time this year, they are actually focusing very heavily on COP26. But there is a lot of difficulty humanizing the story in Trinidad and Tobago, because like I said, we are not yet, we don't experience things like Category 5 hurricanes. So we're still dealing with slow onset. And we're at the early stages of that in Trinidad and Tobago. We've seen extreme flooding. We actually have seen each year, we've broken the record for the hottest day on record each year has been broken progressively. But we haven't linked what we're experiencing to the climate crisis. So people are this year realizing that COP26 has some heightened level of urgency. So all the media houses are running a lot of editorials, I think, sometimes a little heavy-handed from politicians, business chambers, and whatnot. And I'm here as a reporter, perhaps the only one from the English-speaking Caribbean who's here on the ground, trying to track these negotiations and send stories back home that can keep people up to date. And for me, the challenge is how do you get them to see themselves in this story? And it's particularly challenging too when we aren't here. Like I said, we are absent. Our people aren't here at COP26. And
right.
and if we're experiencing some of the earlier stages of slow onset effects of the climate crisis, then people aren't connecting the dots. So I think it's all over the newspapers. There's one particular story that seemed to get a lot of attention, where the headline was life or death. This is a life or death situation, and it appeared pretty close to the front page. I think it was one of the first times that a climate story appeared close to the front page in my country. So I was really surprised by that. But some of the other stories that I thought would have been pretty significant to do with representation, or even one that came out yesterday where a regional energy, a CARICOM, which is a regional body for the Caribbean, the energy head for the secretariat said that our NDCs aren't ambitious in Trinidad and Tobago, and kind of weighed in a bit on what that meant for the region, as well as provided some context as for why, because Trinidad and Tobago has invested heavily in the technology to keep this hydrocarbon industry going. So he weighed in on all of this, and I thought it was pretty groundbreaking that somebody who is a regional authority would weigh in on this. I thought it would be this huge story, but then when you looked at the level of engagement that this story got, it wasn't as high as the one that had the headline, this is life or death, coming from an activist. So I think what people really would need to see in my country, and what I hope that I could highlight more of when I go back, is stories that put a human face to some of what has been happening here. So I want to stay in touch with the two young people from my country who've been here. I've also met some young people from other Caribbean islands. There've been a small few. There's one from Montserrat, which is incredible because Montserrat has a population of just 3,500, and they don't even have an INDC. They're the only country, only one of 15 CARICOM countries. They're so small. They don't have the capacity to make an INDC, but they have a youth activist here. I'm going to stay in touch with him. I want to keep talking to these people. I want to hear their stories. I want to learn more about the work that they're doing. And I think if I keep doing that, hopefully we will see more awareness, more people engaged, because we are living in the climate crisis right now, and we are on the front line. And I just don't think people in Trinidad and Tobago get it. And
That's
yeah.
so interesting. I think that's a great idea, that to track that person or those people going forward. What's their role there? Are they with an NGO, or are they youth activists? The person you met.
So the reality is that it's very hard. It was very hard for young people to get here this year.
Yeah.
From the Caribbean, they all had to come here through mechanisms that were not really related to their country. They found funding from outside, and they had to fight to find that funding. There's one group in particular that did a great job. It's called Unite for Climate Action, that brought a network of 21 young people from Latin America and the Caribbean here to participate in COI for Young Go. And this was probably a godsend for the region, because had this group not mobilized these 21 youth, I think there would have been almost no representation, because that was where the people who Nicola Sturgeon invited to meet with her, they all came from this one group. They have pretty incredible stories. And Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the core youth delegates who were supposed to contribute to the global youth statement that was presented to the world leaders here at COP26, the awareness of climate change is so low in my country that they were not able to get more than 10 responses when they were trying to generate data to include in Trinidad and Tobago's contribution to the global youth statement. Therefore, Trinidad and Tobago did not include an official statement. So the one youth, Shandell O'Neill, who was able to come to COP26 through United for Climate Action, was able to play a role and contribute to this global youth statement. And that would be the only Trinidadian voice, and one of, that was able to do this. There were 32 country youth ambassadors, two from each CARICOM island, that wanted to come to COP26 to carry out their duties, have their voices heard, officially contribute their country's part to the statement. And none of them made it there. None of them were able to find funding. The governments didn't support. Of course, our governments grappling with the disproportionate effects of the COVID crisis, because not only are we dealing with the climate crisis, but COVID has disproportionately affected small island developing states. So to say that many governments would make it would approach this from, this is an extraneous expense from where they would sit to bring a youth activist. My country sent one youth activist here, Priyanka Lala, young person, 14, got to speak with her. She has a brilliant perspective, but there's so many more. There's so many young people who would really have loved to come here and to speak with Chandel and to hear how they were able to maximize their experience here. I think the true value is networking, because it puts them in touch with different organizations. It gives them a platform. They end up being reported on. They make it onto mainstream media, and it amplifies their voices. Because of course we know about Greta Thunberg, but I think that there are a lot of other youth activists who should have a much larger platform, who are coming from countries who live on the front line of the climate crisis. And if we amplified their voices more, and people could see that climate change is urgent, because this particular young person here is speaking because perhaps they're losing their home, they are displaced, or if we could get that message out there more, I think you would see people being a lot more alarmed. Some of the people who are less receptive to messaging on climate.
No, that's that sounds. I think taking that forward sounds important. And social media are important too, especially maybe if you could build a conversation between the news reporting you're doing and young people on. I don't know whether Instagram or back in Trinidad, where people live online, but finding a way to use that process to integrate that into the news, into the journalism would be cool too.
Yeah.
Let me switch to Vishani too. And you're all on Twitter. I wanted to show your most of you are at any rate. So Vishani, here was something you were focused on, again, trying to explain how this global phenomenon relates to the geography right there at home. Seems important. Is the story catching hold there?
I think particularly what has been insightful is that I can tell you that climate change stories, they're perhaps, so I'm with Newsroom, which is an online entity, and so we can sort of gauge interaction based on those metrics. So what I can tell you is that climate change stories, they're traditionally or normally the least read stories that we have on our website. It's not attractive, it's not appealing to people at all. So just to try to sort of bridge that, what we've been trying to do is to, whenever I write about climate change, I center it a lot on flooding, because flooding is the natural disaster that affects Guyana the most. And so you can see this story here. Instead of putting a picture of our minister who I interviewed for this article, I used a very recent picture of the this devastating flooding that happened. This was overtopping over a seawall. We literally have a concrete barrier that's about 280 miles that separates the coast from the Atlantic Ocean. And that's where a lot of the flooding happens. And so a picture like this sort of helps our stories to get a bit more reach, but still the bottom line is climate change stories are not, as we like to say, as sexy as the rest. And that's just something that we have to continuously work to sort of, as Zico said, center people, center these stories around people, because that's really the only way we found that we can connect people with our stories. However, I think ahead of COP26 in particular, there was a lot of momentum built up about climate change. So even as early, I think it was June or July, when the CARICOM heads of government met, they already started talking about CARICOM's position on COP26 and some of the things, the issues they'd be raising, and their advocacy for a vulnerability index for finance and so forth. Then there was the CELAC summit. Again, they spoke about COP26. They all went to the UN General Assembly. They spoke about the position of small island developing states ahead of COP26. And so this has been an ongoing conversation for us, and it's been something ongoing that I've been reporting on. So there's sort of I've sort of been able to generate that interest or that sort of anticipation for COP26. I can tell you specifically for COP26 and climate change stories from COP26, there has been perhaps a marginal increase in the interest, but still, by my standards, I appreciate that. I'm very grateful for that.
That's great. And let me just switch to something here from, whoops, hold on. From Domenica again. Whoops, wrong one. Sorry. It's early in the morning here. I'm still getting my brain in order. Stop screen. And just Domenica, back in Ecuador, there's stories. I know. Well, tell me, what are the stories that get on front pages, and what are the stories that you feel are missed as a result when you think about forests, indigenous rights, oil, climate? Is it still a hard sell?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm lucky to work in a media where we have we mostly publish stories about the environment, gender, and human rights, which are things that aren't usually talked about. But in most places, the things that would get headlines would be like the creation of the new marine reserve, which is that, um, like the announcement of that, because it's the Galapagos Islands and everybody wants to go there. Um, but then when it comes to talk about indigenous people, they would probably only get headlines if there is a protest where something got damaged, which is really sad. But yeah, like anything that has to be about the environment that does not get any headlines. I'm the only media from Ecuador covering, and yeah, no one else has been covering what's been happening here besides the announcement of the creation of this new marine reserve. But besides that, really, nothing has been getting any attention. And yeah, like I even before coming here, I have a lot of people asking me what COP was because no one
Right.
ever covers it. So yeah. Also, I have to leave because we have a meeting.
Yeah,
But,
no, I think
but it
we'll
was
call it
great to
quits.
meet you. Yeah.
We'll call it quits fairly soon because it's hard to forget. You realize people have to realize you're in the middle of the final day of this big event. So very quickly, maybe Jennifer, a last word from you. What's the indigenous action going forward?
Yeah, so I talked about Article 6 a little bit, and unfortunately, it may be possible that if we're not able to formulate the right rules that include a strong human rights statement and Indigenous people's rights, the news stories that would come out later after COP may be about violations of Indigenous rights associated with carbon projects being carried out in Indigenous territories. Just now, I was alerted about a carbon project in Borneo that locks in an indigenous community for 100 years into a carbon project without any consultations or consent, let alone consent from the indigenous community.
I'd like
The
to
other new,
make sure to send me a link about that.
I will. I'll send you the link.
Maybe
Yeah,
everybody.
Andy,
Yeah.
it's actually been covered on Monga Bay already. You can probably check
Yes,
it out.
Yeah,
that's
Manga Bay
right.
is amazing. Okay. But anyway.
Yeah. So if we don't have strong rules coming out of the Article 6 negotiations, those stories can continue. Then, one of the other stories that came out quite strongly from Indigenous peoples while we were here was, there are a lot of Indigenous peoples from Brazil who were here in last week, and they were in pretty high level events. And one of them got a death threat right after she spoke out against the negative policies of the Brazilian government against indigenous peoples there. So yeah, so that's sort of my way of trying to talk a little bit about Article 6 and the need for human rights and indigenous people's rights in Article 6, and the kinds of stories that could come out if we don't have those strong rules. And
Yeah, that's the details. So, Chris, what does it feel like in terms of Climate Tracker and next steps for you? How does this grow? There these global networks getting journalists like Vishani and Eric and everybody to be a community to sort of share tips and keep in touch feels very important. I know the Earth Journalism Network does this here. The Society of Environmental Journalists in the United States does this. Does this build a community that you can sustain going forward?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, journalism is such an art of individuals at times, but it is wonderful when you can kind of get a bit of a collective sense to it. And we certainly have seen that some of the kind of most interesting stories we've been able to publish have been collaborations between journalists from, one journalist from Egypt and one journalist from Ecuador, for example. And some of our kind of fellowship programs specifically try to design for that. So whenever we can get those collaborations going, it's always a win. But I think that kind of the interesting thing that has been happening is that while more journalists are interested in climate change, I think we're still struggling with how to sell it. And Vishani was, highlighting that already, right? Even if you write great stories about it, if it's performing badly, it's pretty hard for your editors to make that call that we want to pump that up a little bit more. So I think we still have a bit of work in figuring out how to give the story the right sell, but also give it, keep the integrity there.
Vishani, how does that feel? Does that ring a bell for you?
Definitely it does.
I wonder in the Caribbean, particularly, maybe this already exists, but there's these networks, sort of journalism networks that have evolved in different parts of the world. I'll show one example. InfoNile.org, which is sort of it's journalism across the Nile Basin, which extends through about, I think it's 10 countries are part of the Nile River watershed. And they do collaborative reporting sometimes. It's not just an aggregator of articles. Here it's a cross-border group of geojournalists with a mission to uncover critical stories through a region that's not defined as a country. It's the Nile. And so it's Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, Egypt. And I don't know if there's a network like that for the Caribbean, but it might be a way to sort of do consolidated looks at Caribbean issues going forward. Is there anything like that, Bishani?
Not that I'm aware of, but what I can tell you is that in the Caribbean, you don't necessarily have, I actually don't know if there are any sort of specialized journalists, I would say, because a lot of us, especially here in Guyana, everybody covers everything. And so it's only like when an opportunity from Climate Tracker, for example, comes around that I get to focus on climate change a bit more. But all the while I'm covering COP, I'm still covering politics, crime, every single thing else. So there's this sort of balancing that we all do. We don't have these specialized journalists, I would say. Here in Guyana, especially, I can speak with great confidence about Guyana, but across the Caribbean too, we don't have that many specialized journalists.
Yeah. Well, maybe they're the one thing I've been working with some journalists on. There's a journalism organization called Global Press. It's female journalists in a lot of developing countries, and I did a session with them on focused on climate risk. So it's not about climate change, meaning this big global warming issue. It's about what risks does the climate system pose to our society, and then it's hurricanes and in the Caribbean or flash flooding and landslides. And that's something that then directly relates to local policy. Actually, the forest issues we were talking about before, indigenous rights is a basic human rights issue. And if you look at climate risk as the lens, suddenly everything gets a little bit easier to sell to me. And it also because it's not just about this big international question of emissions responsibility. It's about what is our government doing or not doing to plan for, not just for the future, but to help us withstand hurricane impacts now. Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas was a classic example where the story really wasn't climate. The story was, why are Haitian workers, migrant workers, in a slum that is in a floodplain that was devastated by that hurricane? A few weeks after Dorian, the Bahamas government was putting out press releases, hey, we're still open for tourism, because the hotels were fine. So the story was a justice story. It was about economic disruption, people from Haiti ending up moving to there for the work. And so it's just a way, if you look locally at risk and dynamics, it can kind of break that pattern of, some editor thinking, oh my God, this is that global negotiation thing, boring. It feels like a pathway in. And then you include, well, hurricanes are changing because of global warming. It's not making it a climate story. It really is a local story. So I could talk sometime. I'd be happy to do a conversation with journalists from that region to see if we can talk about ways to do that a little more. And the indigenous community, I've had a strong interest since I was at National Geographic Society a few years ago in facilitating indigenous voices having their direct connection to the media landscape. Ford Foundation, others are doing really good work at. One of my favorite entities out there is ifnotusthenswho.com .net, I think it is. And if not us, then who? Is a sort of an indigenous voices network, and facilitating that is a great thing to do. So thank you all for being here today. I know it's, again, a crazy time, and this is the Sustain What webcast from the Columbia University Climate School. I'm Andy Revkin, And we'll keep this conversation going forward. Great to be partnering with Climate Tracker, and good luck to all of you getting home and doing the work that needs to be done between COPs, which helps determine what happens at COPs. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.